Probably would help if I had been able to give you some PowerPoints, but I wasn't able to, so this is more of a lecture format. I want to start by expressing my appreciation to Stanford Children for your commitment to adequacy in funding and accountability in spending for our schools, and your success in organizing parents to engage their schools and school boards, as well as your campaigns to go to approval for additional funding, which you've done in many districts around the state. I'm going to talk about the tax side, about the revenue problem we have in Oregon, because we have both a spending problem and a revenue problem. My talk this morning will be more about the history and analysis of Oregon's tax system rather than a tutorial on how it works. And I hope to give you some meaningful themes, and I'm going to highlight 4 lessons learned from about 2 decades of work that I've done on tax policy in Oregon, both in the legislature and on ballot measure campaigns. Mostly in my prior positions in the union movement, when I was president of the Oregon AFL-CIO, and prior to that, when I was representative of the Service Employees. I'm not going to dwell on this point, but I think we should keep in mind all the conflicts we're having now over PERS policy and bargaining outcomes and so on, that public sector unions in Oregon deserve the lion's share of the credit for preserving the level of funding for public services that we have today. When you look back at the last 2 decades, that's very clear. The record should show, and I think we should remember that the public sector unions here in Oregon held that day a strongly funded movement from the forces represented by people like Grover Norquist to turn Oregon into a state where government was small enough to drown in the bathtub, to use Norquist's term. Now, we didn't always win. As a matter of fact, when it comes to property taxes, we were major defeats. But on other measures, with income taxes and spending limits, unions led the fight that preserved at least what we have now. And I think it's obvious, it should be just as obvious that we'll need strong partnerships with our unions if we're going to reform our tax system and provide adequate and stable funding for schools going forward. I was going to start with a tutorial, but with a few test questions. I think John made it easy to answer. And it's true or false? Is Oregon a low tax state?
Yes.
True. True or false? Is Oregon a low spending state?
Relatively.
Not so much. Because of what John showed you earlier, and I'll explain in a minute, we managed to backfill a lot of the tax cutting done over the last 20 years with other sources of revenue, things like lottery and higher education. So we're a state, I would say, that's a low tax state with high expectations for its public services. And it's those expectations which have led us to find other ways to shore up funding when we cut taxes. We got to be a low tax state by cutting property taxes in the 1990s, faster and deeper than any other state I'm aware of in that decade. In 1990, we were 17th among the 50 states in state and local taxes. By 1995, we were 43rd, just 5 years. That occurred in spite of the fact that Oregonians have never really been an easy sell when it comes to tax cuts. We care about fairness, we care about funding for our schools and other services. And as I said, we have in Oregon voted to reject a lot of other sides, more tax cutting and non-McIntyre spending limit initiatives. But when taxes rise faster than our ability to pay, as happened with property taxes in the 1990s, that's what sets the stage for voter resistance and tax revolts. And then when the architects of tax cut proposals are able to convince voters, or at least some of them, enough of them, that their tax cuts move on services we care about, that's when we get Measure 5 in 1990 and Measure 47 in 1996. Measure 5 not only cut property tax, it directed the state to make up the difference in schools. And Measure 47, which was revised and became Measure 50, rested its case for many voters on the fact that there was enough waste in state government and enough revenue coming in at the state level. We could make schools whole even with another round of property tax. Now, that didn't materialize. Those measures left funding gaps that we've had to fill with other means. One is what we've done with our tuition in post-secondary institutions. Right after Measure 5 passed, by the way, tuition increased in our university system by 45%. It's been going up twice the rate of personal incomes ever since. Now, funding for schools and other services, though, wasn't the only issue that emerged in the campaigns over Measures 5 and 47. The issue of tax fairness was prominent as well. And progressives, some of whom were in this room, I see Joy Marshall, Joy will remember this, progressives responded by focusing on what Measures 5 and 47 did to the tax obligations shared by households and businesses. And there was good reason to highlight this issue. By cutting property taxes, we cut the main source of tax support from business taxpayers. That was going to schools and local government services. And by replacing the property tax with state income taxes, we resorted to a tax which is primarily paid by households to make up the difference. Approximately 80% of state income taxes are paid by individuals, with the remainder paid by corporations or by small business owners who pay the personal income tax. As a result, between 1990 and 1995, the share of Oregon's state and local taxes paid by business taxpayers declined from 46% to 39%, and the household share increased from 54% to 71%. We managed to backfill and minimize cuts, but we did so at a high price for working families. So lesson number one is, that I want to share with you today, is who pays matters a lot in the politics of taxes. The effect of the property tax cutting in the 1990s was, as I described, a dramatic shift from businesses to individuals. By 1997, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy summarized the effect as follows. Oregon has chosen a tax structure in which households bear a higher percentage of the initial tax burden than do the citizens of most other states. As a result, Oregonians see less in state and local public services for each dollar in tax they pay directly than do most Americans. Now that's policy talk. To translate into blunter political language, we created a vicious cycle in which tax shifts to households fuel kind of a cynicism with government. And when voters felt they were paying more, we're getting less. And that in turn created a receptivity to more tax cutting and more anti-government rhetoric, and it created a vicious circle. But the postscript to lesson one, I think now, we have to admit, is that the business household tax argument has become kind of passé. Other states were cutting the business taxes as well during this period. It's just that we did more of it. And it's hard now for a small state in an increasingly competitive global economy to go back up the down staircase when its political leaders continue to try to woo and keep employers and grow jobs in our economy. Now, we did manage to take one small step back up the down staircase on corporate taxes with that new minimum tax for corporate taxpayers, a higher rate for large corporations, that was passed in 1967, several years ago. But the fact is that we're now an extremely low tax state for business taxpayers, and we're at the point that a corporation like Nike asks not for more tax cuts, but for keeping things as they are. I think that says a lot about our taxes, how our tax system works for businesses, and I'm not saying that's bad in all measures. But I think it's something we're going to have to put behind us, and I think as you see the politics of tax debates, both at the federal level and Oregon, we have to put it behind us. The new debate now is about, as John said, the 99% and the 1%, about progressivity and fairness among individual taxpayers, rather than that debate about the business tax share and the household tax share. So I think what I've just shared with you now is more a historical artifact of the kinds of debates and the kinds of struggles we've had in the past. And I think that's going to shift much more now to the kinds of debates we have over Measure 66 and the level of fairness between low income, and wealthy taxpayers. But it's also important to recognize another fact from our experience in the 1990s in particular. And that is that we squandered the revenue dividends of a strong economy in that decade. And we're still suffering from the effects of that experience today. Let me explain. The mid to late 1990s were a period of strong economic growth in the nation, and even stronger economic growth in Oregon. It was one of our best decades ever. John can tell us whether it was the best, I think it was one of the best. And as I alluded to in my Oregonian column last Tuesday, the revenue dividends from this period of economic growth didn't do much more than keep school funding just kind of on an even keel. John's data shows that too. As we were replacing all the property tax cuts that were taking effect under Measure 5 and Measure 47 and 50. Washington State, which experienced a similar boom, managed to direct more of their revenue gains to boost their investments in schools. So the results of these contrasting experiences, I think, are quite telling. In 1990, just before Measure 5 passed, Oregon devoted more state and local revenues to its K-12 schools than did Washington State. On a per-student basis, we were 5,688, they were 5,505. We were spending 2% more per student. Fast forward to 2008, the last year for which I could get comparable data, Washington was spending 5% more than Oregon on a per-student basis, and their school day was 7 days. The school year was 7 days longer. That is a telling difference, and that happens to coincide with other charts on the other lines on the chart John was showing you, where Washington State's economy continued to grow, their personal income grows, and so even though we're roughly, in terms of total taxes from our economy, the same as Washington, we see Oregon's at we collect 9.8% of personal income in state and local taxes. Washington State collects 9.7%. But they have a richer tax base. They have a higher earning workforce. They have better jobs. They have a more productive economy. And that explains a big part of the difference between what our two neighboring states experienced, who basically both benefited from, both experienced a strong economy. One, shifting all of the revenue dividends from that strong economy to backfill tax cuts at the local level. The other, investing the revenue dividends from that strong economy to build up their school system. So the takeaway here is that disinvestment in schools can lead to another vicious circle, where continuing to disinvest means we continue to have economic decline. How we break out of that cycle, I think, requires both cost cutting. John's made a strong case on the PERS side, and I agree with him on that. And by the way, I'm a PERS retiree, I'm the one who brings down that $24 average. I only worked with the state for 6 years. But we're also going to have to do it by raising revenue, not just cost cutting, not just revenue raising. Thank you. So lesson number 3, when we start looking at how we might raise some revenue, lesson number 3 stems from our over-reliance on property taxes and income taxes, and our propensity over the years to carve out more and more tax credits, deductions, and exemptions in those taxes. To the point where, by a decade ago, and it's still true today, we forego more revenue in property and income taxes than we actually collect from our taxpayers in those tax systems. So, in other words, our tax breaks add up to more revenue than the revenue collected from our property and income taxes. And once these tax breaks take effect, they're very hard to get rid of. There have been numerous attempts to do so. Every tax break has a constituency which thinks it serves a purpose. Every tax break was created for that purpose. And the efforts in the past years to rein in tax breaks have produced only minor or minuscule effects. There was one effort in 2003 where the only tax break that was repealed was a property tax exemption for credit lots. But the legislature is getting smarter about this. They're now putting sunsets on more and more tax credits, which means when they come up for review, unless there's an affirmative vote to extend them, then those tax breaks expire. And we're starting to see more about budgeting of tax breaks, and you'll see some of that this year, where of the tax breaks coming up for renewal, it may be that they want to renew them all, but maybe they want to scale them back a little bit. And the Ways and Means folks in the legislature are starting to talk to the revenue committee members in the legislature and saying, can you take this package of tax breaks that we're looking at this session and maybe squeeze out 50 million or squeeze out 100? And those kinds of conversations, actually, I think, are the ones that you'll see more of this year. You'll see that in regard to the senior medical deduction in the state income tax system. How much of the benefit of that goes to high-income seniors? Can we do some scaling back there? Another favorite of mine in the past has been the fact that we allow, as do most states, and as does the feds, we allow owners of second homes to write off their property taxes and their mortgage interest on their second homes. That's about 20 million a biennium, but 20 million a biennium is the end of the school day, the school year. So the mantra we were using some years ago, not to any good effect, unfortunately, was what do we care more about, second homes or second grade? So
That's a good one.
some of that will be part of the churn in this legislative session. But rather than going tax break by tax break, there's also talk, we even heard about it in the presidential campaign, and Romney talked about limiting tax deductions. We heard about that with the Republicans in their negotiations with President Obama. The House Republicans talked about limiting deductions. And the governor in the State of the State speech just last week. There's another approach here, which is let's look at the totality of exemptions and say they're all good, but that we can't afford taxpayers to use them all to the hilt. And we're going to force taxpayers to choose which deductions they want to use. If we put a cap on itemized deductions in the state income tax system for any individual at about $30,000 a year, we raise over $400 million now in the biennium. Now that buys a lot more school days, rehires a lot more teachers, and help reduce class sizes. The problem with that is that there's a sticking point on that one. It's the capping of charitable deductions. When you think of how there is a valid reason to want to encourage wealthy people to donate not just to charities, but for certain public purposes. Think of what's going on now between Phil Knight, the CEO of Nike, and the University of Oregon. And there's probably going to be a major donation from Mr. Knight at some point in the future. It's probably helpful that we give tax breaks on, if his income is otherwise taxable and he gives it to you and doesn't pay a state tax on it, that's something we may want to continue. And so, by some calculations, that $400 million plus could still is a large enough amount of money that we could say for those who are giving above the $30,000 limit on deductions, we want to continue some form of tax credit or deduction for them. We could do so. We limit it to Oregon charities. Not out of state charities, but Oregon charities. I think we could bring that in about $200 million. So $1 million minus $200 million, a net $200 million on that proposal. And I think it's starting to get some currency in this session. I got a call from one of the Ways and Means co-chairs last week asking me to explain this all to him again. So, and I've heard some talk from legislative leadership that we're trying to get $200 million out of tax breaks. So, this is maybe something where it's a marginal change. Doesn't change the nature of the taxes we have now, but it does bring more income into the income tax. And it does so at a time when, as I said, we're going to need both cost cutting and we're going to need to be raising some revenues in the next biennium, even before we tackle the larger issue of comprehensive tax reform. Now, on that larger issue, there's some talk now at the local level about how we might modify a constitutional amendment. The limitations that now apply under Measure 5 in particular to kind of local levies and proposals for funding at the local level, where you go, where local voters approve an increase, a local option levy for schools, and some properties will end up paying zero because they're already at the Measure 5 limits. This is full of technicality, and I don't want to go into it too much. My worry is that any campaign on this subject is going to boil down to, are we raising property taxes or not? And when you look at the polling on this, property taxes are even more hated than income taxes. So I understand why a lot of people are talking about this. Leader cities are fashioning proposals. I'm worried that immediately there's more potential in looking at limitation on tax breaks or more money in the next biennium, and that beyond that, we should be working with the governor for a comprehensive tax reform, which in Oregon, this is lesson number 4, means a sales tax. Packaged with other tax deductions to raise more revenue and achieve more stability. Now, lesson 4 is all about cautions around the sales tax. The first caution is that we're 0 for 9 when it comes to votes on the ballot. The second is that it's not true, as a lot of people think, that a sales tax is kind of a painless way to raise revenue from outsiders. Even if you have all the revenue from tourists and visitors, what you collect from them is about what it takes to administer the sales tax, what it costs to administer the sales tax. So, I mean, it's not one of these painless new taxes. And it does hit low-income people harder than high-income people. So, it's always going to require some combination of puts and takes, some other adjustments to rebalance the system, so it's not disproportionately affecting low-income or middle-income or millions. And here's where another caution arises. Any major tax overhaul of that kind has lots of puts and takes, and invariably creates winners and losers. And, political lesson I learned well, the losers are always a lot more pissed off than the winners are. So that's always going to be, the complexity of this is always going to be a challenge. But we do want to look at this in ways in which we might be able to make the sales tax package less regressive. I don't think we can go overboard. I think the perfect can be the enemy of the good, in the same way that a less than perfectly progressive system of taxation can be the enemy of better funded schools and human services. I think it's very important to always look at not only who pays, which I already made that point, but who benefits from how we spend those dollars and where we invest them. What the polling and focus groups tell us, still, this hasn't changed much in the last decade, is that a majority of voters are disinclined to approve the sales tax unless it's combined with the complete elimination of another tax, like the income tax or the property tax. Then they'll go there. But then that doesn't leave us anything with which to raise on the bottom line. It actually raises resources to schools. But there is an idea that I think would meet the voters halfway on this subject, and it was first proposed as one of several advisory votes that went to the voters in May of 1990. We had a whole bunch of advisory votes on what kind of tax system you want to see. And although it only got 37% of the vote, that's the highest percentage that we've ever seen in the sales tax. And that proposal was to establish a sales tax and, as part of the package, completely eliminate property taxes for schools. Now, you think of that, schools are about 1/3 of the total. We have a $5 cap on property taxes for education. We have a $10 cap on property taxes for other local government services. When I went back to the most recent data and crunched the numbers, it turns out that we could look at something like a 5% sales tax, with plenty of exemptions for food and medical care and housing and those kinds of things. Completely eliminate schools' property taxes, not just for K-12, but for ESDs and community colleges, and still easily raise over $1 billion in revenue. So this is something which is maybe worth thinking about. The reason, or the historical reason, the history of how we got the state income tax, by the way, back in the late 1920s, was because it was used to replace a statewide property tax. Not just, we had back then, not just a local property tax, but a statewide property tax. And voters approved our income tax in order to eliminate statewide property tax. Well, here we are, generations later, talking about maybe the deal here is to look at a sales tax that can help balance our system, provide more stability as well, and one which would replace the school property tax. Now, the other reason for that, there are a couple other reasons now which make this idea perhaps more palatable. One is we're equalizing funding around the state anyway, so with the exception of some local options, no matter what level of taxation we have in a local district, the state's making up the difference in equalizing. Another is that the level of business taxation has reached a low point in Oregon, so that when you look at how sales taxes affect a business taxpayer, it actually would increase the business tax share a little bit. So to go back to that argument of that sub-1990s about business and individual tax shares. So back to my tutorial mode just for a minute in conclusion. There are only 3 ways to raise general revenues through taxes. Taxing what we own, taxing what we earn, and taxing what we buy and sell. And you know we do the first two to the point where, although we're actually a high income tax state and a medium property tax state, but we're often off the charts on the bottom when it comes to taxing what we buy and sell. And if we want to, if our objective is to raise the revenues we'll need to achieve our educational goals and stabilize our tax system and keep it sustainable, then I think we're going to have to find a way to start taxing more of what we buy and sell and less of what we own and earn. And we have to do that in a context in which we're also being rigorous about controlling costs. John has made that point very well. What I worry about when the revenue discussion goes forward, let's say we're successful with another $200 million by controlling, reining in tax breaks in the next biennium. $200 million is about what the governor is hoping to save on the school funding side with his PERS changes. And you can expect that there'll be some legislators feeling the pressures here from our friends in labor not to go there. And we raise the $200 million, and all it does is avoid the PERS solution. We've got to do both. We have to keep after, in a reasonable way, controlling costs, being fair to employees, keeping compensation certainly in line with the growth in compensation in the private sector. We have to raise revenues not to avoid those decisions, but to be able to invest more in our schools and make a difference in the next decade. Thanks.
Yeah, you were mentioning the major 5 property tax limitations, and you said that would obviously be viewed as a property tax increase. So my question is, one way I've been looking at, a constitutional change to major 5 would be that it would allow local districts to increase. They wouldn't have a cap that is currently in place, percentage-wise. So that would, of course, have to then be subsequently, you have to have constitutional change, then you have to have a local,
right,
property tax implementation. So that would be down the road, but what would happen in the immediate term if you remove, I'm assuming that it would relieve the compression issue, so what would be the immediate tax burden or increase versus, what local municipalities or, could determine in the future?
You mean in terms of who pays?
No, how much?
Well, how much revenue is compressed that would be released?
Yeah, so if you had the constitutional change that eliminated those, right now today, property taxes, what would be the immediate effect? Not, discounting any local school district option.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know. I don't have the number. But I think the way this proposal would advance, though, it would require some, at least what I've seen in polling that's got the most chance of passage. You would first ask the voters to allow future votes in districts to take, for those future votes, to take whatever those proposals are and vote them in. So I don't think there's any likelihood that we would see kind of an unleashing of what's already compressed.
Okay, well, that's what I'm hoping to hear. Because, you just wanted, I think the way to present this is to say, look, this is just allowing localities to make that decision. Right now, their hands are tied.
And that's got the most potential. Now, I would say, as to whether that, let's talk about the wisdom of whether that should go forward. If it goes forward, as the Constitution knows, by the most likely in 2014, if the governor is putting together a comprehensive reform package, we can't have both going at the same time. But if he's not, then I think that's going to raise the interest in the proposal you're talking about. Yes.
You talked about how we have such a low corporate tax rate here. We also have businesses who are very adamant about having difficulty attracting top quality workers here because our school system is so bad. So how do you get them to make that connection that if they pay a little bit more in taxes that go toward education, that they'll be able to attract a better quality workforce?
I don't think they argue with the premise that the more spending on education means a higher quality
But that they have some
There's always a question of who pays and
Right.
who feels fair.
Right.
And so many businesses, here's the thing, and it's real. When a business starts with a business plan, it figures its costs, its rent, its taxes. And when changes occur, it's always something which disrupts that plan. So that's why it's a down staircase. Every time you take a step down, that's the new position from which people do their planning, their business plans. And it's really, really hard to kind of go back up. So I think there's the understanding about relationship, for sure. I think the Urban Business Council, John's been doing a lot of work with them at their summits. We're attracting over 1,000 people every year. That's always a topic of discussion, question. And I think the answer lies in the sales tax package, because business is willing to go there. And the fact, it's coincidence almost that one might argue that that actually raises the business tax rate, but it raises it in a way in which they can manage it because it's related to what they buy and sell. Yes, sir.
My question's about change. What, in your view, has changed, either fundamentally or very recently, in the political situation that would make something like a sales tax more viable or changes, fundamental constitutional changes, more possible?
That's a good question, and I think what we've seen in the debate over taxes and how progressives view it and how others view it is there's just a lot more focus on the fairness among individuals. And we see that in how the round one, the fiscal cliff debate ended up in this. I think this was a change election too. And I wrote another column about the fact that in this last election nationally, and it was the same in Oregon, the votes cast from voters under the age of 30 exceeded the number of votes cast from voters over the age of 65. And they are a different generation. They're not as obsessed with taxes. They're not as kind of ideologically obsessed with the size of government. They understand education. A lot of them are paying more for it. A lot of them understand how burdened they are with student debt. I think this last election was a change election, and I think we're going to see more and more of that playing out in tax politics as well. Yes.
In terms of the shift of funding from local communities to the state, which would be even more so with the sales tax, that disconnect for local communities and what that does to funding
Well, you
schools.
still have local school boards. I mean, that disconnect has happened too. I didn't highlight that in my presentation, but as a result of Measure 5 and the fact that the state now provides the lion's share of funding for operating schools, it's already happened. It would continue in that direction, but we would have to give thought to the fact that we have local school boards now, which are responsible for spending the dollars. I think the new achievement compacts that have been set up between the state and local districts are one way to enhance that connection. But it will lead to other conversations about statewide bargaining, perhaps, for school district employees, or at least regional bargaining. So all that's happening, I think, regardless. Yes.
And how does it affect when you talk about making the changes on raising the property caps, sales tax, business, for rural Oregon, which has been, they have a higher unemployment. I mean, it's so hard to get new businesses coming in. How is that gonna, I mean, most voters, if you look at elections, are in the Willamette Valley, and Central and Far East Oregon just get shafted. I mean, in some ways.
But at least rural communities haven't been hurt, and in fact have benefited to some extent by the equalization of school funding that we've done in Wake and Measure 5. And so when it comes to school funding, in terms of the dollars available to be spent, that shouldn't change much. It shouldn't hurt the rural communities. They will be a little bit more affected by the fact that they have lower tax rates. Some of them have low school tax rates, well below $5. So I guess in that sense, the sales taxes they pay might add up to more than the property taxes they're paying for schools. So that would be credence to your point on that one. Yes.
I want to talk just quickly on the Measure 5, Measure 50 reform that's out there. In a vacuum, if that were to pass without considering any other tax reform, that would allow a greater increase in what districts can do in a local option levy. What effect would it have in the amount of money coming from the general fund into the education fund, if any at all? So I understand it would allow us to go out and get more taxes in our local option levy, but the way I understand the math, it may not affect how much money we have in the general fund for education, or that gets allocated to the general fund.
If we waive the Measure 5.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
So it would help for the local option levy, but it wouldn't necessarily increase the general fund money.
That's right. That's right.